Welcome to another episode of the Wild Edible World podcast. This is Steve, one of the hosts. My other half, Michael, is lucky enough to welcome baby Kirk Andrew Baker into the world, so he's not able to join us. But we brought in a couple other people to help out instead.
Hi, I am JB. I wish I had the ponytail that Michael does, but I'm just thrilled to be here and be on the panel with everybody.
Hello, I am Jim McDonald. I can probably pull off the ponytail, so I'm also happy to be here.
Sean Zera. I used to have a nice ponytail, but yeah.
I'm GABRIELLE Cerberville, and I guess I'm bringing the ponytail today.
And I'm Chris Gavin. I'm thrilled to be here.
And that is Rachel. You might hear a little bit of that in this podcast because we are live. We do have a live crowd. We should probably turn on these. And now we're officially live. Howdy, folks.
Hey guys, JB here again. So this is a panel obviously about the sustainability and the ethics of foraging. Both of those topics could of course be their own panels. There's a lot to flesh out there. So I think we want to just take it from the very top. For people that are new to the foraging space or a novice in one of your classes, how do you start the conversation talking about sustainability and ethics? Where do you bring people in for the first time?
So I lead a lot of walks. This is Jim. I lead a lot of walks, and what I often do is I will point to people to what I call the first two rules of wild crafting or foraging or wild harvesting, and I try to stress that both rules are equally important. It's like not number one and number two. And the first rule is to be certain of your identification. So not like I think this is wild carrot, but I am sure that this is wild carrot, so that we don't make mistakes in foraging, which can be okay or unpleasant or terrible, depending on what you confuse wild carrot with. And then the other first rule is to be sure that you can gather a plant in both an ethical and a sustainable manner. And I don't think those two things mean the same thing. I think you can gather things sustainably and maybe not ethically. So that's a consideration there. But I also think that when I bring up that topic, I want it to be like a forethought and not an afterthought. So like I'm going into learning about foraging, and before I'm picking, I'm considering the ethics and the sustainability of how I'm collecting, rather than like mostly I want stuff and I'm going to pick it, and then later on when someone tells me that I did it wrong, I maybe feel like defensive or like, oh no, but I think it's okay, or I checked and it's not threatened or endangered, which is a too late place to start thinking about those topics.
Similarly, when I'm doing plant hikes, I like to just weave sustainability in. Oftentimes I'll mention something up front, but I save the big message for the tail end. But it's definitely something, when I'm giving plant hikes, sustainability and ethics are something that I'm going to weave into there, because my presentations are a lot like a food web, where there's a lot of different intersections for things to come up with. And so, for example, I'll oftentimes talk about thistles, which are a great wild edible. And we have, here in the Great Lakes region, we have dune thistle, which you would not want to harvest because it's federally endangered. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got bull thistle, which is an invasive exotic, which, please harvest away. And I like to tell people in my classes that, a lot of thistles are somewhere in between those two. And then as we get on individual plants, we talk about how there's certain parts that you can't over-harvest. And again, that a sustainable harvest might look different than an ethical harvest if you're, say, trying to leave something behind for others. That's something that's ethical, but doesn't necessarily hit on the sustainability spectrum per se. But a lot of times I talked about how invasive exotics are something you just want to remove from the landscape. And then with mushrooms, that's just a fruiting body off of a thin thread-like network of an organism living in the ground, and you could no more unsustainably harvest mushrooms than you could apples from an apple orchard. So there's a lot of different touching points. So I like to weave sustainability and ethics in throughout the conversation.
Yeah, I am primarily a mushroom educator, so I really like teaching people about not just mushrooms themselves, but the places where mushrooms like to grow. And so one thing that really matters to me is making sure that the people who are learning from me are not just learning what things are and how to eat them, but also how to read landscapes. So I want people to be mindful of like how they're moving through a forest when they are going to collect something, and to think about the impacts of removing something in the long term. Thinking about removing things in the long term, and how we can make choices that can positively affect not just us, but everything that is a part of that system. Because, with mushrooms, I see mushroom spots die all the time because they are over trampled, not necessarily over harvested, but because we're not necessarily paying attention to all the things that those mushrooms need in order to create a system that sustains their lives.
No, I think that's a great point that you make there. Like, not only is it more popular than ever to forage now, it's more available and accessible than it's ever been, right? As far as like the knowledge to forage, everything's a 30-second reel or a 45-second video. So how do you like differentiate, to the public? How do you really educate them in foraging ethically,
Yeah, one thing that I always like to stress to people is when you're, again, you really need to learn your plant identification. But don't just learn how to ID the edible things or the things that are useful. Learn how to ID everything, because you want the context of how everything is interacting in order to really understand how you would go about sustainably doing anything with it.
I think Sean really brings up a good point. When I give plant hikes, I always stress to people to treat plants and fungi and wildlife like human people, or like people. Not that necessarily they're human people, but treat them like people. And, there's ones that you're going to want to have a relationship with. And, in terms of foraging, it doesn't get much more intimate a relationship than taking something, putting it in your mouth and having its body become part of your body. So that's an intimate relationship that you have. But, when you're treating plants and fungi like people, you get to know people that you don't necessarily want to have or need to have a relationship. But it's just, you want to know, well, who knows who's hanging out with whom. You want to know people's faces and their names, even if you're not necessarily going to have a deeper relationship with them. It just broadens your social interaction with the human people, but your ecological knowledge, and it makes for a much more colorful and deep interaction with the natural world.
I think everyone needs to speak closer to the mic because they can't hear, and this is turned up about as loud as it could be.
Thanks.
A little bit of crowd activity there.
Okay, that's all the kids. They're really excited about what we're talking about. I love when people say stuff. I'm like, oh, now I don't need to say that, right? They cover that. I don't need the person to say that. A lot of times when people are learning about plants or foraging, or I do a lot of medicinal herb craft, they learn about a plant and they want to find that plant. And what I want them to learn about is the habitat and the ecosystem, and learn about all of that. So you might learn a plant and say like, oh, I'm pretty sure it's this plant. And you're like, are you sure it's not another plant? And if they don't know how to identify that other plant, they might not be sure of that, right? So we want to learn how to identify the plants that we're looking for food or medicine. We want to learn to identify the plants that might be toxic or hazardous or potentially fatal. That's really important. So you should always learn the plants that might be dangerous, that share space with you. And we want to learn the plants that might be species of concern, threatened, or endangered so that we can differentiate them or know if maybe we found this really cool special place where some plant grows, in which case I might be like, I'm not harvesting that plant, but I might want to just leave that ecosystem alone. I might want to let that ecosystem be because it's special and unique, and I can probably find this plant in a different place without sort of like going in and creating a lot of activity or disturbance that might affect that unique ecosystem.
Yeah, I very much agree. I often say that the most dangerous forager is not the one who doesn't know anything. It's the one that knows 5 things, because they will think everything that they see is one of those 5 things. I think you're right on. I think something else that we can do to encourage sustainable harvesting is to get people to explore further and wider when they are collecting, not to just stay in that one patch of woods that they know, but to travel over more ground so that you're not over collecting in one area. You're getting to know a lot of plants over a larger area.
Yeah, I'm hearing a pattern with all of this, and I think rightfully so, that there's a lot that should be learned. There's a lot of breadth of knowledge that would be helpful to think through these things, think through how to harvest sustainably. And of course, as we know, there is not like a 10 commandments for how to do so sustainably. So what kind of guiding principles do you guys abide by that maybe might help guide beginners that don't have this entire knowledge, that don't have 10 years of experience yet?
One thing that I kind of like taking a step back and looking meta level, and one thing I really try to impress upon people who want foraging knowledge from me is that they really need to be honest with themselves about where they fall on that spectrum of like confirmation bias. Because, I will run into people who will see something and they'll be like, I've always wanted to find chanterelles. I'm looking in the guidebook. This doesn't quite look like chanterelles. It doesn't quite fit the description, but it's sort of the same color-ish. I think it is chanterelles. That's it. It's definitely chanterelles. I'm going to gather up 20 pounds of them and serve them to my entire family in like a beef stroganoff or something like that. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, a safer place, but not necessarily a better place to be, is the person who's like, I've always wanted to find chanterelles. I'm looking it up in the guidebook. It's a dead ringer. I can't find anything that even remotely looks like it in my guidebook that this looks more like that than anything else. But you know what? I'm not even going to have a little nibble until I get the state lab results back and it's been DNA tested positive that it is 100% a chanterelle. Most of us, of course, fall somewhere between on that spectrum, but the person has to know going into it what kind of person they are. Are they the kind of person who's going to convince themselves quickly that they're an expert on the Apiaceae or the carrot family, or are they the kind of person who really thinks that they maybe need to learn a lot to really trust harvesting members of the carrot family in wet environments before they feel comfortable?
Sean, I see a look on your face.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I think is important is to use all the resources that are available to you that you can find. Don't just rely on one thing. Talk to people that already are knowledgeable about things that you're interested in. Use field guides, use apps, but don't rely on any one thing. And always as you're building up your confidence, check several completely different angles on it, and that'll really build your confidence. If you try, like obviously a lot of us are going to be, using our phone, checking on an app to see what something is. But once you do that, then go check it in a field guide and see if you come to the same conclusion through the field guide, and you'll feel a lot more confident that you have, in fact, that the app has reached the correct conclusion and that you're not, overly relying on it, but also build your confidence up as well.
Yeah, I really like encouraging people to use apps to confirm an identification that they are already suspecting that they have. Something else that I think apps can be helpful for beginners is to help narrow something down to genus, because it's pretty good at that, even with mushrooms. So something like iNaturalist, you can snap a few photos, learn how to take good photos for an app, because not everybody does, and you're going to get an answer, but it may not be the right answer, and you can get yourself closer to the right answer by learning how to take the right photos for the AI. But then never rely on an AI to identify your food. I would not rely on an AI to give me good information about how to get to my mom's house at this point. So I wouldn't rely on it for information about my food either. You always confirm with other sources. I use iNaturalist all the time for logging locations and for trying to figure out things that aren't immediately evident to me. But just make sure that you're doing it responsibly. We have all this new technology that's available to us, and we should use it and we should train it to make it better. But we need to be careful about how we implement that.
Oh, wow. Now I have all kinds of different thoughts. So with regards to apps, there's some desmodium across the road. And this year and then 2 years ago, I've taken several pictures of it, and it never says desmodium. It says poison ivy. It says hog peanut. It says a bunch of other things. It has not come down to desmodium yet. I've gotten the stems held apart in my hand. I can't get it to say the right thing. So apps take several pictures, and if you take several pictures and they come up with different answers rather than all the same answers, then that's a reason to be especially concerned about it. Another thought I have with regards to you go out and you find something that you've always been looking for, ask yourself, have you ever found something that you wanted and thought, no, I'm going to leave this one? Because if you've never done that, there might be a time and a place for that, and you might want to recognize that I don't seem to have the ability to say no to my desires. My friend Howie Brownstein in Eugene, Oregon calls that plant lust. I love plants and I want to have them and I want to collect them, and that becomes the motivating factor that overrides maybe other considerations. And we just want to be honest and recognize that in ourselves. And if we can say I've been looking for this for so long, I really want this, but I think I'm going to let this one be. I can come back tomorrow. I can come back maybe next week, but right now I feel like I don't have to take it because I want it. And then another thing I think is really important for people getting into foraging is start in your yard. Before you go out into forest, before you go out into intact ecosystems especially, and it's I found this amazing thing or that amazing thing. There are so many wonderful, edible, non-native, invasive, weedy plants that will just grow in your yard, and your yard is immediately accessible to you. And that should be the first place that should be the main place, I think, that you have a lot of foraging basis, unless you live in the forest, right? That's a little bit different. But you can just walk outside and say, what greens am I going to put in my omelet? I don't have to go to some other place. I'm going to go out in my yard and see that there's chickweed, or see that there's plantain, or see that there's dandelion or violet or whatever. But so many different things grow in our yard, and that should be an early starting place to familiarize ourselves with foraging wild plants before we go out into potentially more sensitive ecosystems that we might not understand as well and might inadvertently potentially do some harm to.
Yeah, that's super true. I think something else that we tend to maybe forget is that sometimes our eyes can be a little bit bigger than our pantries. And if you're foraging in your yard, you're a lot less likely to take more than you need because it's in your yard. You can just go pick it, or it's, back behind your apartment building. But if you're going out into the woods and you see a bunch of ramps, maybe you're going to take everything you see because you don't know the next time you're going to make it out there. I like to, personally abide by only taking what I know I can use in a reasonable period of time. And sometimes that means I run out before it comes back. But it also means that I don't have a freezer full of things that I can't eat.
I think another like fertile ground to see what I did there for foraging in like a garden or your backyard is let's just say hypothetically you've got a spouse who likes to garden and would appreciate removal of all the purslane, lamb's quarters, amaranth, and everything else that's popping up in the garden. I mean, that can be a win-win situation and a really great training ground for feeling like you've got a positive idea on a plant because there's not a lot of toxic lookalikes popping up in people's gardens. And once you've identified 3, 4, 5, a dozen plants positively, you have the confidence and a little bit more of that discernment to be able to go out into the woods or the prairies then and start harvesting from more natural or wild places.
Sigh.
Well, what's wrong, buddy?
Well, I just realized this mushroom supplement I bought isn't actually made with mushrooms. It's made with something called myceliated grain?
Myceliated grain?
Oh, no!
I'm sorry to tell you, buddy, but myceliated grain is a sure sign of a poor quality mushroom supplement.
Well, dang. I wanted mushrooms, not brown rice. What should I do?
Well, you should support a small batch producer from right here in the Midwest, Keweenaw Apothecary.
Keweenaw Apothecary? Tell me more.
Keweenaw Apothecary specializes in high-quality mushroom extracts from Michigan, and they always use real mushrooms, never myceliated grain.
That sounds like exactly what I've been looking for. Where can I order?
Well, you can find them at keweenawapothecary.etsy.com. That's KEWEENAW apothecary.etsy.com. Be sure to read their many excellent reviews.
Thanks, buddy. I don't want no low-quality mushroom products from a factory. I want Keweenaw Apothecary.
Wowie wow! Wowie wow! We've got a new hot sauce for you.
It's so delicious.
It's spicy.
It's spicier for sure.
Spicier. It's called Harvest Moon, made with ghost peppers, American persimmons,
and spice bush berry.
It's gonna be great. We also have t-shirts available. Brand new t-shirts.
The best t-shirts, I think.
Baseball tees.
Scrumpers United.
If you've collected apples, if you've collected fruit, you're
welcome to the club.
You're welcome to a club. You're a scrumper. So check out our merch store, wildedigblewordpod.myshopify.com. Wowie wow!
Yeah, I'm loving hearing everything from everybody about building confidence and like being really sure of species identifications for the purpose of sustainable harvest. That makes so much sense to me. Jim, earlier you mentioned that you think that sustainable harvest and ethical harvest are different things.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you see that?
So, in terms of sustainability, you can you can harvest plantain with wild abandon and not worry about like decimating the plantain species in your area. That's highly unlikely to happen. But if you sit down in front of a plantain and you pluck every single leaf off of it and leave only 2, that's just kind of not ethical. I mean, to me anyway, and I know ethics is subjective, but like, or if I have a mullein plant, which is a non-native species, and some people, in different places, it might be considered invasive or a noxious weed. But if you harvest all the leaves off of a mullein, like to me, that just doesn't feel good. It would be like, oh, gather a few leaves here, go to another plant, gather a few leaves, go to another plant, gather a few leaves. Even when I pick yarrow, if I'm picking it, rather than just cutting the stem, a third or halfway down and being like, that's my harvest, I will pick a few of the flowers out of the corym of the flower structure of it and leave some flowers and then pull some leaves off the stem. And then the plant is still there. It still has flowers. It's still going to produce seeds. It's still there for the pollinators. It's still there for the other species. And I was able to gather stuff that I need. It might take me a little bit longer. It might be a little bit more labor consuming. But when I can walk back down the trail that maybe I walked up and still see that all of the plants that I collected from still have some flowers and still have some leaves, I just feel pretty good about that. Like, I feel like, oh, okay, I'm good with that. And we can't do that with everything, but we want to think of, like, when I can, what is the lowest impact way that I can harvest a species? If something is, like, wickedly invasive, then yeah, take as much as you can. You know, get the roots out, dig it up, get it out of the area. But in a lot of cases, I think if we can manage our plant populations and do something in a way that, again, not is only focus on ensuring the survival of that species, but just, oh, that feels good. I feel like I didn't take more than the plant could spare. I left each stalk with a little bit of ability for the other things that rely on that. Because the plants aren't only here for us. They serve roles for different kinds of insects and different kinds of animals. They do different things. And the more that I can leave with each plant, sort of like the better I feel. And that there's a little bit of personal interpretation there, but that's good, because when you have personal interpretation, that means that you're thinking about it. That means that you can do something and then maybe go back, because I like to also go back to places that I harvested from and be like, ooh, I harvested in this area. What is the impact? I want to go back the next year and be like, I feel like I did a really good job harvesting in this area. And then I look and it's like, did things not grow back the way that I thought they would? Oh, maybe I need to rethink the way that I did it.
I think one thing that seems to be a commonality with all of us is that what at least what I've found is that encouraging relationship builds that restraint. If you encourage people to build that relationship with the plants and the mushrooms that they are encountering, that they are using for food, that they're using for crafting, that relationship encourages restraint. When you start to see the plants, the trees, the mushrooms as non-human people, these living things that have their own agendas and their own lives, we are more likely to be less wanton with how we harvest them.
Kind of at the other end of the spectrum, though, and then Jim touched on this briefly. If I'm harvesting garlic mustard, I'm going to go into an area and I am going to pull so much of it. And if I'm even gathering any of it to eat, I'm just picking off the tendermost tops. I mean, it's almost like the botanical version of shooting a white-tailed deer and just stripping out the backstrap. Totally unethical for white-tailed deer, but it's a practice I consider to be completely ethical when it comes to garlic mustard or similar plants.
And there's still like an environmental respect there. You know, you're caring about the system, and I'm very sorry that, you know, I can't just let this plant be, but the system demands that I intervene.
Oh, I think that's a really great point, Gabrielle, because what is good for some plants is going to be bad for the entire ecosystem. And so we have to be able to switch our level of analysis. That's going to be really important. And I caught a look from Sean, which I totally get when I made my deer comment, because, you know, when we think about things, too, about, like, the overabundance of white-tailed deer that are going on in certain areas of the United States, that actually becomes maybe not the best example right there, because we really have to think about that individual plant or animal or fungus and its role in the community and how problematic it might be, whether or not it's even native or exotic. It might be a site that's just has had a disturbance regime, and there might be native species that are getting a little bit aggressive there, that if we're really going to help with restoring land, we might need to be very particular managers with that species composition in any given area.
I think it is actually worth talking a little bit about deer. You know, we've been talking about plants pretty much, or mushrooms this entire time, but of course, foraging for meat is also a perfectly legitimate description for foraging, and really brings back the core concept that we're talking about here of why sustainability is important. For whatever reasons, animals have historically been hard hit more than plants by foraging, deer being one example. Deer were before there were any hunting regulations, in the 1800s, people were shooting deer on a regular basis for personal consumption. They were also being shot commercially for sale to markets. And I think there's a publication, Mammals of Washtenaw County, from the 1910s or 1920s, where they mentioned that no one had seen a white-tailed deer in Washtenaw County in 40 years. We actually wiped them out of most of the lower peninsula through overharvest. And for whatever reason, that seems to have happened more with animals than with plants, at least historically. But then, just as a counterexample of how our activities can change this, then with proper hunting regulations, deer rebounded quickly, and now there are, in fact, actually way too many of them, and not enough people hunting them, and we are once again, throwing the system out of balance, oddly, through actually not doing enough foraging of deer.
I think there was a University of Pennsylvania study where they looked at the effect of garlic mustard on Trillium. And it was really interesting because what we normally think is like, oh, garlic mustard outcompete Trillium and they're really dangerous. It's a very invasive plant. They're really disruptive to native plants. And so they made, over the course of many hundreds of acres, these enclosures to keep deer out or not keep deer out. And they found that if you excluded deer from an area, the Trillium could outcompete garlic mustard, but in places that didn't exclude deer from the area, the garlic mustard overwhelmed the Trillium. And we can do studies like that, but it's an example of why, if we are largely plant-focused people or mushroom-focused people, that it benefits us to learn from naturalists who understands larger systems. It benefits to learn about ecosystems. It benefits us to learn about all of the different diverse habitats that we harvest from so that we can understand like the larger interplay of insects and animals and invasive species and how they all connect, rather than doing like, oh, invasive species are bad, right? Because there are no bad plants. There are just plants that are really well adapted to grow in certain areas. Their impact might be negative if you love the other species that used to grow in those areas, but they're not inherently bad plants. We don't have to think about them like that, but we should also understand their impact. Because sometimes we think about invasive species, and I've totally done this, and we might think like, oh, but this plant is really medicinally virtuous and really pretty wonderful, or oh, the autumn olive berries are so high in lycopene and they're kind of great. But no one ever says that about buckthorn. No one's saying that about like Asian bittersweet, right? Because we can't say like, oh, but this is so wonderful about them. And I think if we decide to wildcraft or we decide to forage or whatever we want to call it, it creates a relationship with a place, and that relationship, at least in my idea, I understand this doesn't need to be everyone's idea, but my idea, it replaced like a responsibility to care for those areas. That if we're going to harvest from them, we should also be stewards of those areas, and we can think about what we can do to restore habitats, what we can do to protect habitats, what we can do to reintroduce species, what harvesting techniques allow us to both harvest plants and increase their abundance. So I'm an herbalist, I collect a lot of rhizomes, and I've discovered that if rather than digging the plant up and collecting the rhizome, I just uncover the rhizome in the ground and cut between the growing plants, I can increase plant populations and harvest those plants at the same time, because in a year or two where I broke the rhizome, it starts new growth, and then we get more above ground plants and flowers and seeds falling on the ground. And we learn that by practicing it. We learn that by learning more about like, oh, this plant has these nutrients, this plant tastes good in this recipe, this plant is good for this or that particular condition or imbalance. It's more about understanding how plants work in their environments and what we can do to be caretakers of them, right? So if we look at it as a two-way interaction, like, oh, I can harvest from the forest or the meadow or the bog or whatever ecosystem, but in doing that, I should learn how to give back. I should learn how to encourage growth of the species that naturally want to grow there. That's an important dynamic that should be as much a part of our desire to learn as just what the plants do or how is good to cook them.
Great point. Oh, Gav, do you want, Chris?
Yeah. No, I was just kind of like, I think I might be echoing some of Jim's sentiment here, but the way I view it might be slightly different in that when we become stewards of a place, we're shifting from that short-term selfishness to even a long-term selfishness where we're integrating ourselves into the landscape as part and player. I think it was Elder Leopold who said the oldest task in human history is to live upon a piece of land without spoiling it. And that's where that stewardship component comes in, where we start to play the long game. And we're only going to do that if we get a deeper ecological knowledge, which of course is going to run a little bit loggerheads with what we started with how do you get somebody into foraging, because I think everybody here is both keen on and fairly well versed in ecological knowledge. So, there's going to have to be a learning curve for some people. I only hope to impress upon the people that, I'm living the best life ever by learning about this stuff and by integrating myself into ecosystems. A couple of weeks ago, I was teaching sustainability and ethnobotany at a local high school. And I was talking to one of the kids, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm just like, this is the best life ever. I'm smashing the bones and sucking the marrow out of life." And this kid was like, "Whoa, that's a really cool metaphor." And I was like, "Yeah, I guess it's that too."
Now, I'm hearing a lot about decisions and what information goes into deciding whether to harvest or not harvest something. But of course, that is not the only piece of a sustainable or an ethical foraging practice. Gabrielle, I'm seeing your eyes light up. Are there other actions or perspectives that you bring into your foraging practice that are maybe not just about deciding whether to harvest or not harvest a plant?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my foraging practice is observation. I like going back to the same places over and over and over again over the course of months or years and seeing how they change, seeing how I impact them, and then seeing what damage is done and how it can be undone. So a lot of the places that I like to forage are urban environments. I forage in towns and cities because a lot of the people that I teach live in towns and cities. And towns and cities have a lot of plant diversity because people live there and people bring their plants with them. And another thing that cities have a lot of is pollution and garbage. And so one thing that I really like to incorporate into my own practice of foraging is, just like offering tobacco to a plant, I like to remove trash from that plant's environment. In the winter, I don't really pick a lot of food. I pick a lot of trash. And then those places are more pleasant for me to forage in the spring and the summer, but they also encourage plant growth. I remove invasives. I do a lot of just guerrilla permaculture to try to make those places better, not just for me, but for everything that lives there and the people that also go through those places and have to look at them and experience them. So I think there are so many things that we can do to have almost a net zero impact on the places where we forage. And I do my best foraging in cities. I don't do my best foraging in the woods.
Yeah, I want to jump back for a second on something that made my ears perk up a few minutes ago about the regulations with the white-tailed deer. As foraging is becoming more and more popular, we're seeing a lot of change in foraging regulations, right? Some that are becoming stricter, some that are becoming more lax. And I'm hearing from a lot of you that you have really strong senses of what is a sustainable and ethical harvesting and foraging practice. How do you navigate it when the regulations of a space maybe don't align with your methodology for foraging?
For me personally, I mean, it goes to what the word ethics means, because an ethic is doing the right thing when doing the wrong thing is not necessarily illegal. We do codify our morals and ethics to a degree within law, but that's not, in my opinion, what we're really talking about here. We're talking about doing something that is good for the land or good for each other when nobody's watching. And to that end, for me personally, the law, I take into consideration the spirit of the law. I don't always follow the letter of the law, depending on how I've interpreted the law to be written. One thing to keep in mind is, I totally understand it. As a forager who does sometimes forage in public places, I have had park rangers, groundskeepers, etc., roll up on me and ask me what I'm doing. And sometimes what I'm doing is not necessarily legal. Sometimes what I'm doing is removing garlic mustard from a place where it is not legal for me to remove garlic mustard. I can explain that to the legal authorities, and oftentimes they will understand that. Other times they will tell me that, yeah, but I'm setting a bad example because everybody else who comes in here and doesn't know that this is garlic mustard versus an endangered orchid. And the thing is, when the ranger says that, he's got a point. Some of these, the laws are designed by necessity to be one size fits all. And one thing we have to remember too is that rules and regulations are more often than not written in blood. There's a reason why these laws are passed in the first place. And sometimes that comes back to bite people who maybe have a more nuanced understanding of the landscape. People who look at the deer quotas, for example, and think that's not high enough. I mean, that could turn you into a poacher real fast if you let it. And yet, that isn't necessarily the wrong thing for the ecology of a specific region. So doing what is ethical is not, in my opinion, always going to line up with what is legal or what is not legal.
I think we also have to remember that privilege plays an enormous role in this. If you look back on the history of anti-foraging laws, they were designed to negatively impact Black and Indigenous people. That is a fact. That is unfortunately also law that is written in blood. So that is something that I think, as new foraging laws are coming into effect, is going to continue to impact Black and Indigenous people more than it is going to impact white foragers. And the majority of what we see, majority of the foragers that we talk about and look up to are white foragers, particularly white men. I think that it is worth noting that a white man is more likely to be able to go into a place and perform an action that is technically illegal and get away with it than somebody who is Black or brown walking into that same place and doing that same thing. Speaking from experience here, I am the whitest brown person you will ever meet, and I have had guns pulled on me by people who thought that I was poaching from their land when I was either didn't know that it was private land or didn't know that that was a possibility because, other foragers had come onto their property and had, taken their morels or whatever. It's important for us to be able to recognize that abiding by certain laws can be an act of solidarity because it makes our whole community safer. So I think that's important to care about and think about. I also think that we need to push to have diverse voices in the room when these laws are being made. And part of the problem is that there is no centralized foraging council or anything like that. So the laws are not being made by foragers. The laws are being made by lawmakers.
I go to parks that Sean has. What do? You do stuff. I go to parks that have signs that Sean works at that says, "This trail is closed. Don't go down this trail." And I'm like, I'm going down that trail. And one of the things that I have done as much as possible, although I didn't do it at Sean's Parks, is there's a lot of people who forage who are like, I don't want to ask because someone might tell me that I can't and I really want to. And I think in a lot of cases, like if you make relationships with people at parks and you can communicate with them and so they know who you are in advance, then when they see you, as was once said to me, skulking around in the bushes, they're like, oh, I know who you are, and we've talked, and we have kind of like an established relationship. There is a mythical permit to gather wild plants from state land, and whenever I ask state park people about, like, how do you get that permit, they're like, we've also heard of that permit. We don't know quite what permit it is or where to get it. But different parks have said, no, don't gather something here. Or like, oh, no, you can gather stuff here. Just don't gather like Trillium or anything like that. I think that if we maybe can establish relationships with people at parks ahead of time and ask them, like, what is okay? This is what I want to do. This is what my intention is. And we can express some level of competency. It doesn't guarantee, but it can help to create a relationship where they're like, oh, okay, we know what you're doing, and that creates a different dynamic when we see you doing it than if we don't know who you are and we see you doing it. And I also want to totally 1,000% collaborate with what Gabrielle is saying, that like, yeah, I'm a white dude. Right? There are things that are absolutely and 100% easier for me to do and relationships to establish because when I go to parks and I talk to their staffs, they're also often white people, right? And one of the things that I can do because I'm an instructor and I'm a teacher is I can not just interact with people about what I want, but I can be like, hey, so like I know other people who would like to be able to do this. Can I be a bridge for those people? Can I be like, if I know someone who wants to come into this, if you've told me it's okay for me to do, to gather dandelion greens or plantain or things that are invasive, can I share that with other people and I can be the intermediary that opens up access to a space in a way that is like a little bit safer or a little bit more comfortable. It has some kind of entry point for people that maybe might not have as easy a time doing that as I might.
I think that's a really great point. When I give foraging classes, I always stress to my class the importance of partnering with a local land manager. Unless you have your own access to 200 acres of private land that you can forage away on, it is a win-win situation if you reach out to the local friends of such and such a state park, the DNR, the county parks, whoever is managing that property. If you reach out to them, and it's endlessly useful because you're going to be on their listserv. So if you don't want to be foraging from places that might have gotten sprayed, you will know where it got sprayed because you're going to be on their volunteer list asking you to come out that weekend and spray and where they're going to be spraying. And also just tying it together with like managing an ecosystem. I help manage a local county park that is in Madison, Wisconsin, in Dane County. And we're moving it towards an oak savanna. So we're cutting out all of the elm trees. We're chainsawing them in December. I know right where to be in April for the morel mushrooms.
Yeah, buddy.
So this partnership is a win-win situation where they can get volunteer service from you, and then also eventually, like Jim said, they'll recognize you, and they'll recognize you if you're with a group of other people too, and bringing in other people who maybe wouldn't have such ready access or would be maybe judged differently. And to Gabrielle's point, I've seen judgment shift myself. So I'm about as dark as a white person gets, and I'm aware of what I look like, especially when I used to have my head shaved. I believe a friend of mine described me as normal height and reasonably buff. I know how I look when I'm hanging out at the edge of a playground without my kids there. If I'm foraging, that doesn't look quite right. However, I know what privilege can look like too, because as soon as I start pushing around a baby stroller with my 2-year-old in it, I can go anywhere and forage anything and won't catch flack from anybody. So that privilege component of it is real. And then one thing to remember too, as foragers, the second you start getting wild food from wild places, you are going to automatically be guilty in the eye of public opinion of doing something weird. No matter what color or stripe you are, and nothing gets gets the cops or the rangers or whoever called faster than going out and doing something that just looks strange. I mean, I was once detained for 45 minutes in Jacksonville, Florida, for looking at pine trees from the sidewalk. So, yeah, I mean, we have to be aware of the society that we're embedded in too. And when we talk about ethics and sustainability, it's not just the plant people, it's also the human people that we're interacting with.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And I think just in an effort of time for the rest of this event, what are some ways that our gatherers and then also our listeners can advocate for more power, more negotiation power? Anything like that?
One thing I think we can do is just make sure we're being the best ambassadors we can be ourselves. We haven't really touched on another aspect of foraging, which I talked to people about how social media is not the real world, but a lot of us are connected via social media, and how we present ourselves there can be really important too. One thing I think anybody here who's got even a passing familiarity with social media knows that there's a lot of people there that forget that they're talking to another human being on the other end, at least right now before AI takes over. But be nice to people. I was nice to the cop who pulled me over for 45 minutes in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, he wanted to know why I was smiling so much, but we just need to do what we can to be putting the best foot forward so that authorities, other people, anybody, everybody gets the idea that we're people and that it can and should be a normal activity.
A thing that might be worth summarizing that whole thing as is it's an ongoing conversation between a bunch of different people with various interests or stakes in it, and it's kind of important to remember that it is there may not be an exact right answer to anything that's going on at the moment. It's an ongoing conversation. So obviously one of the things you could do if you really have the time or ability to invest in it is get involved in local government. Try to get on your park commission or something. That's a way to have start changing some of the stuff and get people more aware and get at least local ordinances changed to support foraging and at least make it a little less weird. Talk about it. Yeah, talk about it with people. The more we discuss it, the less weird it gets.
I think that's a great point. Thank you guys so much. This conversation is just one of many that we should be having. The more conversations, the better, right? The more we talk about it, the more people are aware, and the more light is shown upon, an area that needs a lot of conversation. So thank you guys so much. Sincerely, on behalf of myself, Michael, Baby Kirk, JB over here, we appreciate you guys so much, and we appreciate you guys. Hey, look, it's working. Being patient with the sound and whatnot.